Two questions. How have economic sanctions on Russia affected its economy and its war-fighting capabilities? More broadly, when are economic sanctions likely to be effective, ineffective, or downright counterproductive? Welcome to Economics Applied, a podcast sponsored by the Hoover Institution. My name is Stephen Davis. Joining me today are two enterprising and highly accomplished economists. First, Oleg Itskoki is a professor of economics at Harvard. He previously held faculty positions at UCLA and Princeton. Among his many other honors, he is a fellow of the Econometric Society and a recipient of the John Bates Clark Medal. Alina Rybakova is a senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics and director of the International Affairs Program at the Kiev School of Economics. She has held several leadership positions in her career, including as managing director and head of the Europe, Middle East, and Africa research at Deutsche Bank in London. Welcome to both of you.
Thanks, Steve. Good to be here.
Thank you so much.
So, after Russia launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, a coalition of countries, including the United States, imposed new economic sanctions on Russia. There had already been some sanctions before, but a host of new economic sanctions. And you assessed the overall effects of these economic sanctions on Russia in a recent article for the Brookings Papers on Economic Activity, and you also sketched out the broader I think, lessons and messages from economics about when sanctions can be effective or ineffective or counterproductive. So to get us started, give us an overview of economic sanctions on Russia in recent years, what types of sanctions, who imposes them, how are they enforced, and also what are their objectives? So who wants to take a crack at that?
Alina is in the best position to give an outline of, the whole history of sanctions in Russia.
Okay, let's do that, and let's get it. We'll get into some of the details later, but let's give the audience an overview so that they'll have kind of an informed sense for the rest of the discussion.
Excellent. So I won't start with Jackson Vanik in the 70s, but I will give you the more recent history.
Okay.
So just to give you perspective, sanctions or tools of economic statecraft have been used historically for decades, if not centuries. So that by itself is not new. What is new is using sanctions on a highly integrated economy in this sort of post-Cold War era of trying to achieve certain objectives. So for Russia, it is started in 2014. One could arguably say that 2014 sanctions were the warning shot. They were painful, but the message was, if you don't stop here, wherever that was, at the time Crimea, we're going to go on further. So let's not forget that. Then the sanctions in 2022, what is meant to show the cost. You went further, this is the cost. A lot of people who have joined the sanctions discussion more recently, they focus too narrowly on this 2022 period only, right? And then what exactly has been imposed? Most successfully financial sector sanctions, but then we also expanded into the new, less sort of familiar territories like the oil price cap, limitations on oil market, and export controls, prohibiting Russia from getting access to certain critical components.
What we do in the paper is really separately look at the 2014 sanctions and 2022 onward sanctions. And one can make a case in retrospect that 2014 sanctions were successful in really buying the time. Right, they were like a warning sign. They were quite impactful. They were mostly financial sanctions. Russia was very integrated in the international financial market at the time. They gave time both to Russia and to the West. Russia did use that time to wean itself off the integration into the Western financial sanctions. Europe and the US, to a lesser extent, took advantage of the time. And in particular, Europe didn't wean itself from its reliance on energy purchases from Russia, right? But if you, in retrospect, see it as buying time, those sanctions were successful. 2022 was very different. That's already full-scale invasion. And these are sanctions that are much larger in their scope and much more costly as well for the Western countries that impose that. And they've been more of a mixed bag exactly for those reasons.
Okay, so I just want to make sure I understand. So your view is that the 2014 sanctions, while they didn't deter additional aggression by Russia against Ukraine, they delayed it. Is that right?
Absolutely, absolutely.
Okay. All right. So then, yes, it bought time for Russia. That's clear. And you say, as you point out, it bought time for let's call them Ukrainian allies and friendly states. Maybe allies is too strong a term, but it doesn't seem to me that the United States or Europe used that time particularly well. They certainly didn't do much in the way to, or not that much to do Ukraine arm itself militarily and prepare for or deter further Russian aggression. So in that sense, I see how they could have been more successful. I'm not so sure they were in practice.
Maybe I'll just jump in quickly on the 2014 versus 2022, the state of Ukrainian army. I think that did change meaningfully. I think in 14, the Ukrainian army would have not been able to hold back Russia. We're now more than 2 years into the war. And of course, with the support of the friends, maybe allies at times, we have bigger success. So yes, so it's not absolute success, but I think it is still an improvement.
Okay, well, yeah, so I take the point there. I think the Ukrainian military's response to the Russian aggression since 2022 and earlier has been remarkable and extraordinary in many respects. So I didn't mean to implicitly question that. I'm really criticizing the United States and some of the Western European economies that seems to me didn't actually prepare very effectively, nor did they take sufficiently aggressive steps to deter Russia from further aggression.
This is a very fair point, right? So what happened during this period was really fragmentation that happened in the financial system, that Russia relied less and less on foreign funding. It de-dollarized, which was a longer term process, but it accelerated with the financial sanctions on 2014. So it neither had external debt nor had a lot of dollarization in the Russian economy by 2022, which made it much more robust to the ensuing wave of financial sanctions. At the same time, Europe stayed remarkably reliable on Russian energy by the beginning of the war. If you want to identify another failure or missed opportunity, right? This was the period of extremely low military expenditure, falling fast military expenditure around the world, including in the US, and historically very low military expenditure in Europe. And both Europe and US in that sense came unprepared as well. And I guess this relied on the sort of belief that Russia would not go for a full-scale invasion, which obviously in retrospect is a wrong belief.
So there's a couple of really, really important points in what's just been said. I want to draw it out. First, I'll put it in different language. I think to some extent, Western Europe and the United States have been living in this fantasy land that, land wars on Europe were a thing of the past and just wouldn't happen again. And so why bother to really prepare for them? Because it's expensive. But the second point is more about economics. And that is because Russia did have so much time to prepare for the anticipation of further sanctions if they were to make more aggressive moves than they already had before 2022, they were able, as you said, to robustify their economy against these sanctions. That's a broader aspect of sanctions, and there's two sides to it. The anticipation of sanctions and the appropriate steps by the target of the sanction gives the country a chance to deflect and mute the consequences of those sanctions. It's also, and that's a kind of substitution response. You used, de-dollarize their economy, but there are many kinds of substitution responses an economy can make. That also happens after the fact. After sanctions are imposed, the target country will make a number of attempts to adjust to that. So sanctions often turn out, I'm not saying they are in this case, we can get into that, but they often turn out to be of less effectiveness over time simply because the target responds.
You both, exactly nailing it, with the comments. We are all sort of, including the US and Europe, are complicit in helping Russia adjust. We saw this sort of fortress Russia emerging. And at the same time, we still have a lot of investments going into the fixed income in Russia, although certain sectors were off limits. But if you remember, Russia did fiscal adjustment, but at the same time, it still needed a lot of external financing for its fiscal. So it's decided what is the best way to attract temporarily foreign investors is to have this inflation targeting, offer them positive real rates. While in the meantime, we're trying to squeeze our fiscal and reduce our reliance, but we're having the bridge financing from the West, to continue doing what we want. At the same time, Europe continued to rely heavily on Russian energy, as you pointed out. So yes, so this fortress Russia that has emerged since 2014, they've seen a lot of telegraphed messages, including on SWIFT, right? And they prepared for them. So we have alternative payment systems, we have alternative messaging systems. We require foreign companies to, like Visa and MasterCard, to continue through the domestic payment system, not an independent payment system. So we've done a lot of little steps which have sort of converged to this fortress Russia, which undermines some of the sanctions taken in 2022.
And I just wanted to make 2 points related to this. So the first one is, if you can rely on overwhelming sanctions response in case of a land conflict, then you can keep those things largely off equilibrium, right? And so that was sort of the premise, that those things cannot happen because there was an anticipation of an overwhelming response from the West. Clearly, it didn't happen in 22. It was a response that imposed a lot of costs, but it was not overwhelming enough to keep those things off equilibrium. And so once it's not off equilibrium, you transition to a very different kind of world where these conflicts happen. They happen with some regularity. They require a response, and the response is very costly for all parties involved, right? When you can keep it off equilibrium, you can rely on a fairly low cost of enforcement.
Just for the non-economists in our audience, by off equilibrium, you mean the prospect of something is so threatening, so alarming, so costly that you don't actually go down that path.
Yeah,
so that's
something that's not
deterrence.
supposed.
That's successful deterrence.
Something that's not supposed to happen, and you deter it by promising credibly an overwhelming response. And that overwhelming response didn't happen in 22, which makes these things possible to happen now. And the West needs to grapple with the fact that those types of conflicts can arise. And it's a very costly situation now for both the countries involved in the conflict and for the Western coalition that needs to impose sanctions. Now, the second point is that trade sanctions are inherently very costly. They rely on curbing the trade, which is, presumably by revealed preference, is mutually beneficial. And so if you're dealing with a large country, and Russia is a rather large country in a number of markets, it is costly for the Western coalition to impose those trade sanctions. Financial sanctions are different. They're much, much less costly to impose because most of the world relies on the Western financial infrastructure, and the West can threaten credibly to exclude those countries from using that infrastructure. But of course, if countries have the time to prepare, the costs of that are much lower. And that was exactly the situation of 2022.
Right. Let's take them separately, because as you already pointed out, they're quite different in their character, but also in their consequences. So with respect to trade sanctions, my very simple way of thinking about it is trade sanctions are costly for the target. They're costly for the country or coalition of countries that imposes them. And then third, what often gets left out of the discussion is they can often benefit third parties. And that's relevant, especially because why? Because you cut off your supplies to the target country, and other countries that aren't part of the coalition and aren't willing to go along step in. So we've seen that play out very clearly in the case of the sanctions on Russia. It means China gets more oil and gas from Russia and at a discounted price. It's played out to the benefits of the Iranians, as I understand it, because they sell munitions to Russia. North Korea, presumably, according to news reports, is getting some type of support for advanced weapon systems in return for the troops and munitions that they're supplying. And the reason I emphasize that is because I think we can expect it to be a general pattern or a common pattern that if the United States and its allies impose sanctions on a country, in this case Russia, that adversaries are likely to benefit, because the adversaries are the one here. I've named a few adversaries: Iran, China, and North Korea. The adversaries are the ones least likely to go along with the sanctions in the first place. I wanted to get your reaction to that because I find it's often omitted from these discussions of the pros and cons of trying to impose sanctions, especially as you already pointed out, on a big country like Russia. It's big in the sense that it's got a lot of land mass, it's a sizable economy, but also it has many, many ways to be supplied by land and by sea that you can't really easily foreclose.
Maybe I'll just start on that. You're bringing the issue of the third countries benefiting from sanctions that we're imposing. And what Oleg has in his theory section is the great discussion about the size matters, right? Market dominance matters, and whether we're able to physically get the large enough coalition, or we have dominance of certain markets that prevents somebody catching up, third country providing this equipment. So I think there's a very good example exactly on energy, oil and gas, which is rather substitutable, especially oil, and then they can ship it a different direction. Gas is much more complicated. Gazprom is cooked, they have a hard time. But China doesn't want the pipeline. They said another pipeline, while it's very difficult to, it's much harder to sort of move the gas around. So there, you're right. In some ways, we have maybe helped out China with more competitive oil market, or maybe left Saudis and somebody else in the Middle East unhappy because, Russia is now competing more directly there. India has picked up a lot of benefits of this low oil price, but somewhat low oil price. On the export controls, it's a very different. It is the technology is still very concentrated. The technologies are concentrated in the US for the chips. Of course, Taiwan has the foundries. From a lot of the equipment that's concentrated in Europe, and then South Korea, maybe Japan. So there isn't, Iranian sort of weapons that are being sent to Russia that are not Iranian really produced. There are still our weapons, our components that are being assembled and then shipped to Russia. So I think here the cry for the third country benefiting is not quite as accurate, mostly because, first of all, we have market dominance. And second, many of our companies are not really fully complying with the sanctions.
You say we have market dominance, but still you're talking about how the Iranians are managing to get access to chips produced elsewhere and use it in
the US, produced in the US.
I know, but they're still ending up, I presume, in missiles and artillery shells and so on that then find their way to Russia. And I think it illustrates, even when you have market dominance, it can be difficult to choke off the supply. And
absolutely. Yeah. Administration matters. I think we're different. One is policy design, and another one is administration. And we have designed policy without concern for the fact that we don't have administrative capacity at the Department of Commerce and at many other places to actually implement this policy.
Let me add two further points.
Yeah, go ahead,
Oz. I think it's very important to realize that contemporary time is very different from, for example, 1990s after the end of the Cold War. The West has the dominance economically in 1990s. It was 80% of global GDP. We live in a very different world now. The Western countries now account for maybe 60% of global GDP. And I wouldn't overemphasize the economic role of Iran and North Korea, but instead I would emphasize countries like India, Turkey, a lot of third world countries that actually are much bigger and act as hubs. And so what happens, of course, China created like a lifeline, economic lifeline for Russia in the first year of the war, and was essential for relocation of trade flows. But then countries like India and Turkey picked up, and they're sort of like really neither allies nor adversaries, but these are the countries that benefited the most. And like what we show in our other work is, in fact, the biggest discounts on saline oil went not to China, but they did go to India and to Turkey. And so these were the new customers that really picked up a lot of slack.
Okay, so that point is well taken, but there's a distinction worth drawing here, which is where do the economic benefits to the third parties flow in some aggregate sense? And as you pointed out, maybe India benefited more than anyone, possibly India or China, I guess, and Turkey benefited a lot. So that I agree with that point. But it's also the case that the capacity of certain adversaries to create mischief in other arenas, and here I'm thinking primarily of Iran and North Korea, has been enhanced, this is my assessment, by the side effects of the sanctions that the US and allies have imposed on Russia. And I don't think we want to lose sight of that. It's not just about the direct cost to our own economies and the the benefits that have flowed to some third parties that are neither adversaries nor close allies, as you point out. So I'm just the reason I'm stressing on this point is because I think of these as less obvious costs of trade sanctions in particular that often don't get enough attention in the discussion.
I
But
think
I think,
it's
yeah,
go
go
ahead,
ahead,
Alex.
Alina.
No, I think it's important nuance to keep in the conversation, but you know, sort of what would be the counterfactual? So instead of Iran or North Korea trying to get access to Western components and shipping it to Russia, we would be shipping our components to Russia for the war equipment. So that is also not a viable solution, right? You know, I appreciate the nuance. The war has created these new alliances, the new axis.
Right.
So let me provide a counterfactual that I think is a meaningful one to have in mind. And this is not the world we live in. So the counterfactual is there is a clear international framework for what behavior of different countries is off limits and requires an engagement of a broad coalition of countries, including China, including India, including South American countries. This would have been a counterfactual world where there is indeed a framework for imposing sanctions that a lot of countries subscribe to, and they benefit from it because if the aggression is directed towards them, they know that they would be protected in a similar way. Clearly, we live in a very different world. We live in a world of discretionary sanctions that are very piecemeal, where instead of having a broad coalition, you need to have enforcement. So what US needs to do is a much broader enforcement, which is costly, but that's the result of not really having a robust framework. 75, 80 years after the, Bretton Woods institutions were established, they stopped working. And so there is a missing framework out there. And this is what results in a very high cost of enforcement.
Right. So I want to add just two things to this discussion. First, yeah, I agree when I think this is the view of both of you that just supplying uninhibited the same kinds of components that go into munitions, for example, to Russia as we had before 2022 would have made no sense. So that's not what I'm arguing. What I am arguing is I think we need to be realistic about the prospects of what trade sanctions can actually achieve against an opponent like Russia. And in my assessment, we can see if you agree, they are limited. And we should understand that ex ante, both in terms of how much degradation of Russia's economy and warfighting capability we might anticipate from the past and further application of sanctions, but also it speaks to the deterrent value of sanctions for a society like Russia. The second point I wanted to make, and this is when I think about, so it's related to what Oleg just said. We want to, and I would add to it, part of this framework idea is if you aren't going to play by the rules, and here violating the rules would be something like trying to change borders by force in Europe, which is what Russia has been doing in Ukraine. That's a violation of the rules, and you'll be excluded from the economic party, so to speak, in significant ways for a long time until you reform your behavior, and perhaps even longer than that. And so the goal is really, in some extent, to degrade the target of the sanctions, to degrade their ability to create mischief, not just in the near term, but I think over the medium and long term. That's part of how I see the Russian sanctions. At least as long as Putin is in charge, and maybe longer, Russia does not seem like it's willing to abide by these norms, these international norms that we had come to see as durable. And so we want to undermine the performance of their economy and particularly its warfighting capabilities until they do so. All of that is to lead up to, well, what's the most cost-effective way to do that? And in Russia's case, I would have thought, and I want to get your reaction to this. I don't know about it deeply. I would have thought that one of the main things we should have sought to do is to facilitate the immigration of talented scientists, engineers, doctors, mathematicians, and so on from Russia after 2022, if not before. Some of that happened naturally, but we could have facilitated a lot more of it, and also facilitated where possible the immigration not just of these individuals but their family members. And I just wonder, do you think that's a more effective way to degrade Russia's warfighting capabilities over the long term? Because this does seem like it's a long-term problem.
I have a strong opinion on that, which I'm happy to share. I think it just happened naturally, as you said. About 1 million people have left. The other thing that you did mention is technology transfer. So technology transfer to Russia stopped. It stopped largely in 2014, but even more so in 2022. And China is in fact not willing to step in and provide the technologies. It's willing to provide trade, but it's not providing the substitute for the Western technologies. And so this will have impact over the long term. If you look at Russian, for example, age and population structure, it's in complete crisis, right? It's 1 million people sent to war and 1 million people that left in the age groups of the most productive, essentially young men, oftentimes with families when they immigrate. And this will have dramatic long-term consequences. The problem is that the war is in its 3rd year, and this cannot have a fast enough effect. And so you have to really separate the long-term impact, and here I fully agree with you, that's a good long-term policy, from the short-term impact and the medium-term impact. The short-term impact is the financial crisis, and that just didn't happen in the first months of the war. The sanctions were not decisive enough in the first months. So then you are in the medium term, and the medium term is curbing the revenues, making it harder to finance the war. And the sanctions were eating off a fraction of those revenues, making trade more expensive. So like making harder to convert the revenues and to purchasing the inputs that are necessary for the war. That's all been happening. It's just not, it's not at the scale that's decisive. Right. And in that sense, yes, if you evaluate it, did they stop the war? No. How significant are they in curbing the ability to finance that war? Well, they're quite significant.
Okay, so Elena, unless you want to jump in, I'm going to transition now to the financial sanctions, which Oleg had just referenced to some extent. So let's turn from trade sanctions. There's a lot more we could say about trade sanctions, of course, but we've got limited time. So let's turn to financial sanctions. And as Oleg already hinted, and please take us back to 2022, there was at least, I think, a hope and maybe even an expectation that the financial sanctions would trigger a crisis, a balance of payments crisis in Russia, an internal financial crisis. That didn't really play out. So let's please talk about that and start by putting us, what did we realistically, or what did some hope to achieve with the financial sanctions? And I guess we need to describe exactly what those financial sanctions are and how they work, put those on the table.
So US has the dominance of the dollar and the dollar-based payment system. So that's really the area where US has absolute dominance, especially when it's doing together with Europe, because then there are really no alternatives. It is hard to drive a country into balance of payments crisis that has double surpluses. So you have current account surplus, you have fiscal surplus. It's not Turkey. Turkey is a wonderful example on the other side of the chart. So if you
explain that for us. I agree with you, but explain why that's the case.
So Russia entered 2022 with the surplus on the trade balance and also fiscal surplus. And that means it doesn't need external financing to cover either of those deficits. They're in surplus, they're accumulating reserves. And this was a big shift for Russia, or sort of it was actually a plan, which some of the international analysts misinterpreted as Russia being more liberal. And that's where you have this liberal bloc of economists responsible under tutelage of Putin and his office to do inflation targeting and sort of do all the necessary reforms after post 2014 to bring them into this absolutely modern IMF-like style adjustment, the balance of payments and balance of payments and fiscal surpluses. We thought maybe because they're trying, Putin's turning liberal, more like the IMF, but in reality, maybe he had other plans. Nobody really knows what kind of plans were in his head. We're not going to speculate on that. But basically, long story short, is that this turned Russia more into a fortress. So when you're pulling external financing from them, it doesn't hurt as much. In 2014, actually, it did hurt. They repaid more than $250 billion in just a year and a half. This is massive, even for Russian standards. The total external gross outstanding debt was about $700 billion, and they had to draw it down because of the financial sector sanctions in 2014. In 2022, the situation was different. As Oleg said, they already disintegrated themselves from the corporate side, from the borrowing on the international markets. Corporates were pretty delevered. And therefore, in addition to the government, corporates delevered, they were in a comfortable situation. That said, there is a signaling effect. Sberbank, the largest bank in Russia, was sending special trucks to its regions to be able to to meet cash demand in ATMs. It was crazy. So if you look at the liquidity position of the banks versus the central bank, Russian banks usually had ample liquidity, meaning that they have so much that they actually save some money at the central bank. That swung into a huge deficit. It is comparable to previous deepest shocks that we saw in 2008 and in other history. So the shock happened. It's just given the preparedness of the economy and the central bank, they could stabilize it fast enough.
Yeah, thank you for that.
To add one more thing to this description, which nails it, is that you cannot separately think about the financial side without net exports, right? And so to keep it in perspective, Russian budget balance could have stayed in balance at oil prices of $45 a barrel before the war. The oil prices went up to 120 and then stabilized above 80. So at those oil prices, Russia was just, essentially printing cash every day from the 5 million barrels of oil that it exports every day. And so that more than undid all the effects of the financial sanctions. So we have a big question. Can you really trigger a banking crisis in a country that, as Alina pointed out, has double surplus? But you make your job all that much more difficult if the country is running a absolutely humongous trade surplus along the financial sanctions, right? And so what we learned from this experience is the combination of export controls, which restricts Russian ability to buy imports. They really undo the effect of financial sanctions. To the contrary, if you combine financial sanctions with import restrictions from the Western perspective that curb export revenues from Russia, that would have been an altogether different story. But that was exactly what was too costly politically to do for Europe.
There's an important point there, but it's a little complex. So let's just draw it out further. So one of the ways in which financial sanctions can be used, and were used in this case, to harm an economy is to prevent it from borrowing abroad to finance the purchase of goods from abroad. Okay, so
even more so, Russia accumulated a lot of foreign savings, and so the sanctions targeted a large fraction of those foreign savings that couldn't be used, for example, for stabilization of the financial market. They were under sanctions, and the Russian central bank was under sanctions.
Right, but I think I understood the point you were making previously is that when you impose restrictions on Russia's ability to import goods from abroad, you are in fact, to the extent you're successful, also reducing its need to finance those.
Absolutely.
So what you're pointing out here, and you do this very well in the article, is that there's an extent to which some aspects of financial sanctions and some aspects of restrictions on Russia's ability to import actually work at cross purposes, whereas export restrictions on what we and what U.S. and its allies export to Russia are more complementary to the financial sanctions. And I think that's an important point to understand that gets lost in the discussion of Russia's behaving badly, so let's just throw everything at them. Export restrictions on Russia's ability to import and financial sanctions, and they don't always all work together.
Yeah, and to summarize this, what we did in the conclusion in the end, what we advocate as the most advantageous policy mix is financial sanctions as much as you can, because they're actually fairly cheap to implement, together with things that curb export revenues that can be used as a substitute for financing, together with very targeted sanctions on specific sectors and inputs that are used in production, instead of a broad sanctions on all imports of Russia.
You said it much better than I did. Thank you. That was much clearer. So, my overall.
Maybe can I just jump in very quickly on the financial sector sanctions? I would add one footnote to that, which I will hope emerge into a whole literature, is the frictions, financial sector frictions. We, in our macroeconomic modeling, would tend to assume it away. It doesn't really matter. Maybe it increases 3-4 percentage points, maybe 10. We can sort of assume it away in the model. But in some cases, for example, payment systems, they can actually create a kink, basically, where you can't continue. It's a choke point. And I think there's a lot of effectiveness of financial sector sanctions in that. By using them correctly, you could effectively block trade. Of course, it brings that back to the question of costly, we were maybe not ready to do that. That's why we didn't go so harshly. But there is that opportunity, which I think is somewhat under-researched.
But I take it now you're referring to payment sanctions in particular,
Exactly.
as opposed to a broader notion of financial
Exactly.
sanctions, which would include ability to borrow and lend. So,
Exactly.
so I guess in the limit, if you completely shut down the ability of a target economy to make use of payment systems, they're essentially reduced to barter.
Exactly.
foreign
And we have
exchange.
seen some of that effectiveness of US using secondary sanctions. And now China, UAE, Turkey banks are stepping back. And Russia's having a harder time to import some of these components because of the threat of the secondary sanctions from the US.
And this gets at the topic of enforcement, that what we learned is that trade is fairly easy to substitute. I think that was a big surprise, how fast the substitution happened. So when there is this massive price movement, countries are very quick to substitute. And policymakers and perhaps economists as well underappreciated the ability to substitute quickly. But the other important thing is enforcement. And it's much harder and costlier to enforce trade sanctions, much easier to enforce payment system sanctions. And this is exactly the reason why combining the policy together with the payment system sanction as a way to enforce things is perhaps a most optimal way of doing it. We've seen in the data that new intermediary traders have emerged for Russian oil. New intermediaries emerged for European goods that traveled to Russia. But once the sanctions were really imposed on the financial system and the due diligence was put on the banks, this is when the sanctions start working a lot better. But it took a year and a half to sort of internalize that.
Okay, there's some subtleties here to consider. One of which is how challenging it will be, and how challenging is it for current and prospective adversaries to develop alternative payment systems. I'm no expert in this area, but it appears that China has for some time been investing heavily in trying to create payment systems that aren't so tied to the dominant dollar payment systems. And here we're talking about how international trade is invoiced, everything from, I feel funny here telling you about this, Oleg, because you've written on this extensively, but there's a set of interconnected aspects of the dollar dominance. It isn't just that countries invoice many international transactions in dollars, but all of the financing around that often tends to be in dollars. The markets associated with that are much thicker, more liquid, hence it's cheaper to do it in dollars. Both foreign sovereigns and foreign corporates, when they borrow, they often do it in dollars, even if they're not doing anything with the US, again, because the dollar denominated markets and all the auxiliary legal and financial services that are around that are tied to the dollar. So everything is anywhere from more expensive to downright impossible to do in certain transactions when you step away from the dollar. Have I got it basically right?
Absolutely.
I would
and
add
I think
to this,
just go ahead.
Yeah, I would just add very briefly to this that where we are in 2024 might not be a good predictor of where we will be 3 or 5 years from now. But in 2024, this is a node that is a complete choking point in the system. We don't fully understand why, but it's some combination of the use of the dollar and the payment systems, and perhaps the messaging systems, that really make having a spot rupee very different from having a spot yuan, very different from having a spot dollar. So in our models, we typically don't acknowledge that difference. We think if you have, a spot exchange market operating in one country, there is perfect substitution. What we see, it's not the case of perfect substitution. How difficult would be to build alternative infrastructure in a year or two from now on, because clearly the adversaries of the US understand that that's the priority. So we don't know. But so far, it has not happened yet.
And that's why I wanted to bring into this research point here, because we all need to focus on it differently. Not just people working use of the dollar from the macro side, sanctions people from their side. We need to work together to understand how it works. And on the financial sector, sort of alternative systems in China, they're still very dependent on the global systems. And I strongly recommend, there is Emily Jin's testimony to Congress, which really spells out some of this detail. Yeah, I think it's about a year old. It's moving every day, but I do think it's an important area to focus on.
Okay, we're going to put a link to that testimony you just mentioned, Lena. We'll come back to you after the show, find the exact link, and we'll put a link to that, as well as your paper, by the way, on the Hoover Institution website for this show. So if people want to follow up, and we'll put links to other relevant materials as well. So this really is, by the way, for anybody who's interested in the capacity of sanctions to really limit the economic performance and warfighting potential of current and possible future adversaries. This thing about the payment system really is critical, and Oleg has already made the point very clearly. We don't really know whether this choke point will be so powerful in 5 or 10 years, or even 2 years as it is now. And we also don't know, I think related to that, how successfully adversaries or potential adversaries like China can quickly devise alternative payment systems that would, even though it's a choke point now, might not be so much of a choke point in a future conflict. That's really a first order question at the intersection of economics and national security, as Alina has already hinted, or said directly, I should say.
Absolutely.
So let's try to take stock here. And here's my assessment and just my attempt to give a high level summary of the effectiveness of these sanctions. And I want to hear whether you agree with it and want to fill it out or push back. Is that well, first, there was some hope, expectation that maybe we could trigger a financial crisis in 2022 that was sufficiently serious that it would completely disrupt Russia's economy and greatly undermine its warfighting capabilities. That did not happen. It did not happen in part because of, as Alina described, the kind of economic reform efforts that Russia had made after 2014 in a way that created this fortress Russia on the financial side, the surplus in the trade account and in Russia's fiscal account. So that's point one. Point two is economic trade sanctions. The kind of economic side of trade sanctions have proved perhaps less impactful than anticipated because substitution responses have been rapid on many margins. And so the extent to which the trade sanctions have compromised Russia's warfighting capabilities, at least in the medium term and the near term, has been limited. They may degrade its ability to create mischief over the next 5 or 10 years. That's a separate issue. And then third, the most potent form of sanctions have been these payment sanctions. Is that, and we don't really know whether that potency will continue into the future, especially with a different adversary, one like China that has probably more capacity to create alternative payment systems. That's kind of my overall read. Have I got it basically right? Have I missed important things? Have I mischaracterized anything?
Can I bring one emphasis here, which I think is missing? Fully on the same page regarding the financial crisis didn't happen. And there are a number of reasons, and a big question, given the circumstances, was it even possible to inflict a quick financial crisis? But I think one thing to keep in mind is the scale of the expenditure that Russia puts on this war, right? So the military expenditure combined are about $150 to $200 billion a year. That's the GDP of Ukraine before the war. So Russia is trying to spend a full Ukrainian GDP to defeat the country, right? Every year. This is coincidentally about the size of Russian oil revenues from exports, $150 to $200 billion. The sanctions, chipped away 10 or 20% of those revenues. And that's not insignificant, but it's only 10 or 20%. And this is something to keep in a perspective. And in that sense, sanctions were effective at chipping away parts of these revenues. Russian budget is actually in deficit at oil prices that are twice as high as they used to be before the war. So that's not insignificant. Russia has used up pretty much all of its national wealth fund to finance this war, and this over the 2.5 years. So this is really what keeps this machine going, right? And it would be wrong to say that the sanctions didn't do much. It's just that this machine was very, very well funded before the war, and that was not a coincidence. That was a result of a long preparation that perhaps was a response to 2014 sanctions, ironically, right? And this is, I think, the key thing to keep in perspective. Of course, you want to really throw in more sand in the wheels of this machine, and that's what sanctions are doing. That's what trade sanctions are doing. That's what payment system sanctions are doing. But one have to keep the perspective of the magnitude and the scope of that machine.
Russia is a weak power, and it's a weakening power because of the war, because of the sanctions. It's very hard to say exactly how much here, how much there came from, but also just to carry on from some of the numbers Oleg was mentioning, unemployment in Russia is just about over 2%. As you've studied many economists even around the world, it's not a natural rate of unemployment for Russia, right? We never thought that we're going to get less than 7% in Russia. And that's why it's not surprising inflation is picking up. And at the same time, rates are more than 20%. You know, Russian central bank had to push up rates that far. We have, for the males of a certain age, unqualified, basically males that can go to the war, die, or produce domestically Kalashnikovs, we see some wage increases in nominal terms, more than 30%. It's almost like a weird U curve where the highly skilled, highly transferable, as you mentioned, IT and sort of specialized scientist people have very high salaries. And then this physical bodies of males of a certain age, you know, with little qualification. So Russian economy is being squeezed. And in 2022, we had a lot of emerging markets, commodity exporters having spectacular growth. Russia had a small contraction, smaller than, of course, many had hoped for. So yes, the glass is half full. You know, Russian economy is struggling. Russia has fully sort of almost fully have shifted expenditure to the war economy. They're trying their best, but they are forced to invest in North Korea or actually ship people from North Korea to be able to expand this supply. They've hit the supply curve, you know, limitations. And that's what we're seeing demonstrated in inflation and nominal wage growth and the rates.
Okay, so that's all very interesting. I mean, I am struck by, you know, I've been struck in this conflict, but even thinking back to the Soviet era, the capacity of the Soviet Union and now Russia to marshal economic resources for military purposes is pretty extraordinary. That's not a new thing in Russian economic history. And there are some autocratic regimes, Russia, Soviet Union being one of them, that have shown repeatedly their capacity to, even with a weak economy, as Alina says. I mean, the Soviet economy was a weak economy compared to that of the United States and Western Europe. Nonetheless, it was, you know, one of the preeminent global superpowers of its day, and like the United States, had the capacity to obliterate all of humanity. So even weak economic powers can cause an extraordinary.
If you allow, can I add one emphasis
please.
here, which I think is extremely important in what you're saying? It's an authoritarian regime, and authoritarian regimes can do a lot of things that democracies cannot. In particular, you can divest or divert, you know, 10 or 15% of GDP from civil economy to a military economy in a matter of a year or two. This is a dramatic impact on the economy, but because there is no democratic process, the people have no way to express their opinions about it. And so this is really important to emphasize. When you're dealing with authoritarian regimes, they can do a lot more than democracies can. And this is exactly why it's so essential for democracies to form coalitions. Coalitions for economic reasons, but obviously, even more importantly, coalitions for military reasons. Democracies are completely weak against autocracies when you need to mobilize resources of this magnitude. And only building coalitions is something that allows democracies to withstand in this respect.
Yeah, I agree with that, but I'd also say that you know, part of the secret to national security and international security for democratic rule of law oriented regimes is the success of their economies. So they are much more successful economically by and large, and that's true for the United States versus China as well. We're incomparably more successful in terms of generating living standards, and you know, GDP per capita and so on, so that we're able to field effective militaries at budget levels that are a fraction of a much smaller share of GDP than what you see in economies like Russia and China and so on. So the reason I emphasize that is just to keep the eye on the ball. Our economic success is vital to our national security.
Absolutely. I meet a lot of colleagues say, oh, you do sanctions. How funny. Sanctions don't work. Look at North Korea. I'm like, yeah, look at North Korea compared to South Korea. So,
Right.
so yes, the democratic ability to produce sort of more creative, more productive allocation of capital and resources overall does make a change. Look at Soviet Union.
Right. All right. I like that. That's a positive note. I want to end. It's a positive note and an important one. So let's end there. Hey, this was a great discussion. I learned a lot, and I also learned a lot from your article, which I highly recommend to anybody who's interested in the intersection of economics and national security matters. Economic statecraft, I guess, is the term of art these days. So take a look. Thanks so much, and stay well, both of you, and good luck in all your endeavors.
Thanks a lot, Steve.
Thank you so much, Steve.
Okay. Bye-bye.